This is actual film of the most famous Wild West show America ever saw, and its leader, the most famous Wild West symbol, Colonel William F. Cody, Buffalo Bill. From 1876 until the First World War, for almost 2 generations, Buffalo Bill represented the West. And for much of the period, another man, less known, certainly less dramatic, Charles M. Russell, was working toward the same end in a frontier art studio in western Montana, working to make sure that his West would always be remembered.
True, at first glance it does look rather ordinary, sort of a tribute to frontier survival. Actually, it's so much more. Among the most treasured log cabins in all the West, particularly in Montana, and especially here in Great Falls, for this was the art studio of Charles Russell. It was built in 1903, about the time that Russell's stature was on the rise and beginning energetically to cross state lines. It was here that he would produce those wonderfully lasting works of Western art. And he loved working here. Or as his wife later said, no other building on earth did he love more. And he never finished a painting anywhere else.
Things here are pretty much as he left them. The tools of his craft and the cherished Western artifacts that governed his taste and reflected his style, his life. Russell's serious commitment to art lasted about 30 years, and his production was enormous. More than 2,600 major works, oils, watercolors, drawings, bronzes, which today are scattered all over the country: New York, Minnesota, California, Texas, Utah, Wyoming, and of course here in Montana. But there is common agreement that the prize Russell art, the most qualitative collection, is at the Thomas Gilcrease Institute of American History and Art in Tulsa. This is one of the reasons, a particular favorite at Gilcrease, the robust and buoyant brought to breakfast. In this oil are the qualities that account for Russell's greatness: time, place, action, story, color, detail, exquisite detail. Russell painted this on commission, and when the patron saw it, he said the picture was slightly wrong. The axe handle. You never saw an axe handle in a cow camp that wasn't broken, he told Russell. Russell agreed. So he picked up a brush, 6 quick strokes. The result, a broken handle repaired with wrapped buckskin. But that devotion to detail was not enough by itself to justify Russell's singularity either as a painter or Western documentarian. It was his personality. Had he loved the land less, or had his affection not been total for cowboys, Indians, mountain men, indeed everyone who figured in the Old West landscape, Russell might have been a minor memory. But his lifelong joy at what he saw and his loyalty to it, so obvious in all his work, make him unequaled. Quite simply, the West never had a better friend, nor a better artist. Charles Russell first saw it in 1880, just after his 16th birthday. Born in St. Louis, he grew up wanting to be a cowboy, and this is where he luckily wound up: the Judith Basin in north central Montana. It was then open range, spectacular cattle country, where Russell lived and worked on and off as a cowboy from 1882 to 1893. Much of what he later painted was based on his personal experiences and observations in this area. His first job was a sheep herder, but Russell and sheep could never get along, and he was soon fired. Unable to get other work, he simply wandered around. And then, in the summer of 1880, he was camped on the South Fork of the Judith River, not knowing where his next meal would come from. But foreshadowing Russell's life, luck intervened. Dressed as a trapper and hunter, a hardened old codger but friendly, who offered Russell food and shelter. The man's name was Jake Hoover, and this is a replica of his hardy cabin, rebuilt on the same spot which he and Russell shared, and where Russell got his first lessons on the Montana frontier, and where he did his first crude sketches in watercolors, working with whatever materials he could find. He helped Hoover hunt and trap, but mostly he listened. The long winter nights of 1880 and 81 had Russell's ears cocked toward a Hoover yarn, and Hoover was a great storyteller, rich in experience, memory, and imagination. And his stories, later the basis for much of Russell's most inspiring art, went back in time to those years before the white man came, when the land belonged only to buffalo and Indians, which in Russell's view meant to God. And there was talk of the later change, which had begun in earnest with the Lewis and Clark expedition just after the start of the 19th century. And of course, there was also reverent recall of the mountain men, like Kit Carson in this painting, Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, and others. Russell never forgot Hoover's endless anecdotes about gold, especially the fabulous strike at Helena in 1864 on Last Chance Gulch. Hoover's commentaries also covered recent history, which in 1880 was the introduction to the northern range of Texas longhorns, or as Charles Russell called them, the white man's buffalo. Russell left here in the spring of 1882 for a trip back to St. Louis to see his family. But he knew then, at the age of 18, that Montana would be his life and that he would live as much of it as he could on horseback. 4 weeks later, he was back, riding north from Billings toward the Little Belt Mountains. He was broke, having refused all offers of aid from his family. But 15 miles out, he ran into a cattle outfit that took him on as a night wrangler. And for most of the next 11 years, he lived on the range, mainly in the Judith Basin, becoming familiar to every cow camp in the territory as a kid who was a joy to be around, who talked better than he rode a horse, who could draw funny little pictures and use his hands to make almost anything out of clay. For the rest of his life, whether he was painting, writing, or talking, he glorified the routine deeds of these glorious years when a cowboy's survival was measured by his skill in the saddle. It was, to be sure, a strenuous life, but less for Russell than others. As a mounted night wrangler for horses and cattle, he was seldom in on this kind of action, but his task was important, simply devoid of glamour. So the danger and sweat of the range and his paintings were not based so much on what he did as what he saw with a lovingly meticulous eye. To say that Russell was inept and the frequently drunk cowpoke of folklore is to exaggerate. He liked good whiskey, but only with comrades, and the accusation that he never stood tall in the saddle, well, in his words, I was better than some, worse than others. I'll leave that judgment to the outfits I worked for. Not one condemned him, neither was he often praised, but everybody was fond of Kid Russell, his stories, his enthusiasm, his energy, his loyalty, his love of the life, and for the men who lived it, and for what was called his eccentric ways, meaning that his saddlebags carried sketch pads and watercolors. This is Utica, Montana. Smaller today than in 1882, when it was the main cow town in the Judith Basin and headquarters for the biggest single roundup in Montana history. It was also where Russell and his friends, united by open air and Bull Durham, posed for quite a few pictures, where they spent what little money they had on bad women and good whiskey, where they let off smoke. Sometimes the horseplay went too far. Tempers got out of hand, whether over gambling or some other frontier diversion. And 26 years later, in this painting, Russell remembered that when guns speak, death settles disputes. Violence happened only occasionally, but that was enough to inspire the flood of dime novels, many of which Russell would soon be illustrating. But the main hazard was the lifestyle itself. Weather, the meanest enemy, like the historic blizzard of 1886-87, which practically wiped out the northern cattle herds. Russell's reputation as an artist can be traced to that winter and his color sketches of helpless cattle. It was autumn 1888, and Russell was riding north through what he described as my own country, where the big hills wear white robes. And later, after the railroads, the fences, the farmers, he would say, the builders have changed the country much in a way that I don't like, but there is still a lot that belongs to God. That affection verging on worship of nature really reinforced his love of Indians, and it was to live with a band of Blackfeet that had him on the move. By then, his first artwork had been published. He was being referred to as the cowboy artist, and the Montana newspapers were full of critical raves about, as one put it, that range rider who never studied drawing in his life but is a natural artist, and who will not take money for his pictures but gives them to his friends. Another newspaper also spoke of Russell's genius, that he was self-taught, and that his pictures were in all the Montana homes that really mattered, meaning even then that to have money was to own Russell art. One businessman had offered to pay the tab if Charles Russell wanted to study art formally back east or in Europe, but he refused and continued north toward Canada, where he would lodge among Indians for about 6 months. It would profoundly affect both his life and his art. Painted 30 years later, it is called Her Heart is on the Ground, and depicts a hillside Indian burial, a mourning widow with her arms and hair cut to indicate her sorrow to the Great Spirit. She will visit this grave site each dawn and dusk for months afterwards. Inside the teepee, a watercolor in which every detail is remarkably faithful, even the inner lining of the buffalo cow skins. Only Russell's intimate observation made it possible. The experience made forever permanent his admiration, indeed his idealization of Indians, whom he characterized as nature's offspring who tell few secrets to strangers. But he was a friend, told everything. One reason was that he learned the language. In this rare film, it's clear that he learned it well, and despite his dangling cigarette, he came even to look like an Indian. No wonder, then, at his sympathies. In depicting the gunpowder and arrow conflict between Indians and whites, Russell painted valor and glory, fleet ponies and fierce warriors. Whether it was the Blackfeet stealing horses, the Sioux and Blackfeet fighting each other to the death, or lookouts watching for a wagon train and its encroachment on their civilization, Charles Russell's point of view is romantically pro-Indian. He once said, "I've known some bad Indians, but for every one of them, I could name 10 whites who were worse." Coming from a man whose tendency was to treat everyone equally, the comment implies his belief that conquest of the Plains Indians was among history's major errors. Regardless, the uneasy alliance that presaged conquest was captured perfectly by Russell in the famous "a doubtful handshake." Each party is willing to make peace, but with one hand on a weapon, willing also to make war. About 50 miles from Great Falls up the Missouri River, which Lewis and Clark chartered in their journey to the Pacific Ocean, are the few remains of old Fort Benton, once an important frontier trading post. This fort, along with others along the Missouri, figured in several of Russell's major works. One is Salute of the Robe Trade, painted in 1920, 77 years after this kind of commerce on the prairies had been discontinued. Another is called The Beggars, a 1908 watercolor in which Russell makes a bitter editorial on Indian humiliation. At the turn of the century, Charles Russell was living here, having married and settled down. His wife was 16-year-old Nancy Cooper. Russell was 31 at the time of the marriage, and almost immediately, his life changed. Under her persistent urging, Russell spent fewer days in saloons and more at his easel. And she also became his business manager. No longer would he give away his art to clear up bar bills. She insisted upon and received steadily higher prices. And before long, Charles Russell was nationally famous. But he didn't change. Nobody, he said, is ever important enough to feel important. But if Russell didn't change, his beloved West did. Yet, he grudgingly said, "The old cowpoke's got no license to kick. He got the cream. Let the come-latelys have the skim." And there was still quite a bit of that. The breathtaking beauty of western Montana that enchants to this day. Charles Russell, this was not only the grandest of scenery, but also a fitting background for much of his most enjoyable art. A fallen elk, which stumbled after being shot, to Russell was where tracks spell meat, yet he himself seldom hunted, and loathed those who did it except for food. Here he revealed both risk and humor. In fact, few Russell paintings are without humor. The hunter has made his kill. His dilemma is how to retrieve it. Russell gave it the title, "Meat's Not Meat Till It's in the Pan." Here, Charles Russell painted a lesson in natural history. In the Old West, pack mules would not follow one another on a trail unless a mare was in front. And for the mules to know they had a leader at night or on a steep winding trail, a bell was tied around the mare's neck. The painting's called The Bell Mare. Russell was not content to paint just a stagecoach. He also wanted to tell a story. Here the horses seem to have been startled by a rabbit. The real cause is behind a rock. And to make sure that everybody understood, Russell titled this 1924 oil, Bruin, Not Bunny, Turn the Leaders. One other high country painting is Innocent Allies, in which Russell depicts the loyalty of three horses waiting on a ledge while their riders hold up a stage down in the pass. Charles Russell was so fond of northwestern Montana, which is dominated by Glacier National Park, that he built a cabin there named Bullhead Lodge on the shore of beautiful Lake McDonald. Construction began just after 1900, and Russell made continual improvements almost until his death. Here he spent many of his happiest hours, both with his family and his countless friends.
And practically every evening at this cabin, regardless of who the guest might happen to be, the routine seldom varied. It always ended with a Russell story, and he was superb at telling them. They were humorous, flavorful, colorful, full of action, and if the truth were ever stretched, it was always in the name of good. In a way, he told stories the same way he painted.
And Russell steadily grew. That growth is evident in this 1918 patriotic watercolor called Beef for the Fighters, a trail drive to the railroad and beyond for American servicemen in World War I. Russell's creative grasp of light and color had now become almost continuously apparent. And far from being illustrations, as they were often condemned by critics, Russell's every artistic venture from 1905 almost until his death revealed a talent that may have been less intellectual than emotional, but it was nonetheless disciplined, humane, and celebratory of this nation's most romantic past. Within this rugged landscape, Russell invoked subjects and events that were uniquely American and his own personal truths. That is his appeal, the authentic connection with what used to be. So his art is not a homage to great Western monuments like the Missouri River, but rather to people and their distinctive way of life. That it passed is what made Russell grieve, the people, their customs, of nature untouched that he could only imagine, like the thousands of buffalo that would come here to drink, or the only hunts that his conscience could ever abide, the Plains Indians in stately and assaulting pursuit. That he understood, for the buffalo was the Indian's life. It was heroic action that produced masterful paintings. The wild and dramatic freedom exhilarated Russell, in contrast to the later mass and indiscriminate white slaughter of buffalo, which repelled him. He conveyed the same attitude in bronze. In fact, every theme that Russell developed in oils or watercolors, he repeated in bronze, and some art critics prefer those to his other works on the grounds that sculpture proclaims Russell's greatness. Still others say that his skill is best reflected in watercolor. But those are matters of taste, not disagreement that Russell failed to excel at each. There is widespread opinion even that his writing was almost as good as anything else he did. Every letter that he wrote, and most were illustrated with watercolor sketches of his buffalo skull signature, as well as some other Western figure or object, had humor and philosophy that reflected greatly on Russell's character. Will Rogers said, in fact, that he liked the letters as much as the paintings. This is the last Charles Russell letter, written and illustrated just before his death in 1926. It says in part, when it comes to making the beautiful, Ma Nature has man beat all ways from the ace, and that old lady still owns a lot of Montana. In 1959, when Charles Marion Russell's statue was presented in the rotunda of the United States Capitol, one of the speakers, Dr. K. Ross Toole, said of Russell, beneath the surface, he carried on a lifelong love affair with mountains and plains, with the wind that was born in the canyons, and the grass that was bent on the hills. Perhaps no man of his time ever understood so thoroughly the uncommon land in which he lived.